Welcome to the RJLT Economics. In this podcast, I want to discuss the situation in France. It is indeed the third time that I'm making this specific recording because in the first try, I included too much impolite language, while in the second try, I made too many digressions. So this time, I want to make it very succinct. I want to develop this podcast in two simple steps. In fact, in the previous tries, I developed it in three steps. But I think does not really need to be as complicated as my previous tries. So first, I want to discuss the situation. I want to describe the situation in France with regards to the fuel shortages and the strikes. And then I want to discuss what I think will happen and what will not happen. I think that's probably sufficient. First, let's talk about what has happened. Since late September, some workers in the fuel refineries in France have been on strike. And this was motivated by the situation of inflation in Europe, in France. In fact, France actually has one of the lowest, if the lowest, inflation rate in the European Union. Nevertheless, inflation is really encroaching upon it's deteriorating the standard of living of all people here, residents of France, where I'm currently living, but I'm going to leave, I think, early next month. But nevertheless, on the ground, I have made some observations myself with regards to the prices. I noticed this past week, that the price of milk has reached 1.75 euros per liter. It used to be 1.45 just before, and 1.35 just a few months earlier, and I think 1.25 last year. So that's about 40% increase so far this year in a year's time. And this is obviously something that is worrying. Of course, milk is something that is somewhat special because the feed that the dairy farmers use seem to come from Ukraine, if I'm not mistaken, and this has caused basically the price of eggs and dairy products, in particular milk, to have shot up much more than vegetables and fruits. Although I must say that since the greatest, not necessarily the greatest, but he thinks he is the greatest president of France took office, the price of fruits and vegetables have doubled. That was, I think it was just probably less than 6 years. And this guy has done such a spectacular job. I think just as he did at his great bank before, he was very good at inflating the price of things that, that's under his control. Unfortunately, this time it is the foods and services that the average French people need to bear, rather than some of these foolish companies that want to basically see who has bigger, what. But whatever. That's another digression. I always go into this type of digressions when I talk about the economic situation, especially when it comes to France. But anyways, you just keep in mind that inflation has been a real thing. It's certainly higher than has been reported by the officials. By basically, the official numbers are seriously understating the inflation. while at the same time, France is indeed having one of the lowest inflation rates, if not the lowest inflation rate in Europe. So this is the background, and some workers went on strike, and there is a shortage of fuel. And of course, we see that cars need to queue up for quite a bit of time. I don't know how long to get fuel, and a lot of filling stations, service stations, gas stations, however you call it, basically empty. They don't have anything. I think diesel perhaps is more readily available than petrol or gasoline, for the simple reason, I believe, I could be wrong, but I believe it is because France imports refined diesel, whereas the gasoline are usually refined locally. That's the difference. Now, this is the situation. Let's go to directly the second step. Let's talk about what I think will happen. I'm really interested in what's going to be the resolution of the current small protest or strike, but I want to look at in the coming weeks what will happen, the months, and more importantly, next year when spring comes. I think there are some talks by some of the more militant unions in France of a general strike. Indeed, I think some doctors, nurses, young doctors, I think, nurses and bus drivers are already on strike, and some of the train workers, SNCF, may go on strike very soon as well. This is nothing surprising. And even though some of these more militant elements have been calling for a general strike, I have my doubts. I don't think that the general strike will take place this year for two simple reasons. First, the pain is simply not there yet. A lot of people, just if you look around in Europe, in France in particular, a lot of people are still going about their lives just as normal. The price has gone up a little bit, 5 to 10%, but that's not something that is causing a lot of worries, especially among young people. But next year, things could be different. And the second reason is that it is getting cold. It is certainly not in the tradition of France to protest too much in these months. They usually go on strike when spring comes. So when in May, usually April, May, June, those are the months when strikes really take place. A question that I was asking in one of my previous tries to make this recording was if there are some elements perhaps from the patron of France basically pressing their thumbs on the little Macron and telling him that he better stand in line or else. I thought this could actually be, some elements, outside external elements, helping some of the more militant unions to go on strike. But then I extinguish this idea because I think Macron is indeed still very much in line with, in tune with the collective West, with the Atlanticist, and he is doing all he can, right? But of course, he needs to pretend to be someone that is protecting the interest of France. Otherwise, he will have even more problems, right? So I think these strikes are organic for the most part. I think it's probably organic. What worries Macron is not that Americans will come in and try to stir up more strikes and protests in France against Macron, but that if he followed the Americans too closely, there will be more strikes and more protests. But next year, things could indeed develop to that degree, especially when it comes to May. I think there has been precedents in 1968, 1958 or something like that, where, governments in France really were either on the brink or actually was brought down. And I would not be surprised if Macron would face some serious protests next year. I'm almost certain that he will face these protests. But I think probably he will survive these protests. I don't think it is quite likely that his government will fall, that he would need to resign. So that's the situation. But that brings me to the final point that I want to make, which is that politically, I think really nothing will fundamentally change. This is one campaign promise that I think Biden really meant it. He is on this regard, I think Biden was really telling the truth. He really hoped that nothing would fundamentally change. And politically, I think in France and in Europe and perhaps in America as well, very likely, nothing will fundamentally change. But as somewhat unexpectedly, particularly to me, and I think to the neocons, the neoliberals, and perhaps across the collective West, Russians took military action in Eastern Europe, and this has really basically disrupted all the strategies that the West has. And I think when it comes to the macroeconomic situation across the world, everything is changing, and fundamentally so. When it comes to geopolitics, everything is changing, and fundamentally so. And in this regard, I would say that perhaps Mr. Biden, albeit sincere in his promise that nothing would fundamentally change, is unable in this case to keep his promise, and will have to see that the world changes fundamentally. I think that's perhaps all I have to say on this topic. Thank you very much for listening, and have a great day.